this is the 16th round of RCEP talks. Many countries are now looking to have some kind of agreement, because already we understand the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is thrown out of the window. They hope they can have a multilateral trade agreement. But what is China's role in this, and what is the likelihood that they can reach any kind of agreement?
Well, precisely as what you have said, given the fact TPP is dead, so RCEP is basically the only game in town. Now, that's going to accelerate the process, because so far it has taken a long time for countries with very diverse background to talk to each other. But I think now the process is going to be accelerated, and there's no doubt China is going to take the leading role. It's going to set the trend. Again, given the fact Chinese economy accounts for more than half of this potential trading bloc.
And Henry, what is in the way of reaching any kind of agreement this time? What are the ASEAN's concerns, and can China help to alleviate those concerns?
Well, the concerns would be, how to assemble this very diverse group together and try to create something that is really meaningful, because, you have the ASEAN countries and you have some developed countries, and also two of the largest developing countries in the world, China and India, both in the group. And I think many of the ASEAN countries and India, for example, in particular, they are going to have some concerns, especially India. They are very reluctant to push for trade liberalization. So a big question mark would be whether or not they will be willing to do it in the RCEP.
And from the U.S. perspective, obviously Donald Trump is not in favor of a multilateral trade framework. How does America look at the RCEP agreement that is initiated by ASEAN, obviously encouraged by China? Troy?
Well, Mr. Trump has talked often about how he feels the United States needs to pursue bilateral trade agreements rather than multilateral agreements. That being said, I think that there is also a lot of support still, both within Congress and amongst many others, for multilateral agreements. The difference becomes RCEP and TPP were two very different types of agreements. RCEP looks to take and remove many of the tariff barriers that were in place between many of the Southeastern Asian countries and China, South Korea, and others, to where TPP looked to take and eliminate many of the barriers that companies face behind the border. And so I think you'll still see, whether it be through bilateral or multilateral forums, the U.S. look to try and remove those behind the barrier borders.
Okay, let's look at the differences between the two agreements a little bit, RCEP and TPP. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has 60 members, excluding the U.S. On the other hand, the Trans-Pacific Partnership includes 12 countries around the Pacific, with 7 countries that are parties to both, including the U.S. but not China. In terms of significance in trade and GDP, the two groups do not have much difference. RCEP members have 12% of the world trade, TPP 13%. In terms of global GDP, RCEP covers 29%, TPP 36%. Well, the biggest difference is that RCEP covers 45% of the world population, while TPP only covers 11%. So there are some differences, but as Troy just mentioned, they also focus on different areas. So RCEP is considered more inclusive because it does not transcend those national boundaries, as Troy just mentioned. So it is more easily to have agreement under the RCEP framework. Is it correct?
I think you may say the bar is lower for RCEP, and also because all these countries, they have natural trading relationship. They are all scattered in the same region. And TPP is more diversified, right? You have countries in Asia Pacific, you also have countries in Latin America. The bar arguably is much higher because given environmental considerations and the labor, so on and so forth. But there's no point to talk about TPP at this point. As I said earlier, RCEP is really the only game in town. But I think potentially RCEP can go beyond Asia Pacific.
Henry, do you think the RCEP framework will become
Yes.
an example for other Asia Pacific countries to maybe follow and join if it becomes successful?
Yes, I think RCEP, if it's successful, could become a template for a future regional agreement covering all Asia Pacific countries, because if you look at the member countries of RCEP, it includes every possible categories of Asia Pacific countries. You have some of the largest developed countries like Japan and Australia, and you have some of the largest development countries like China, India, and you have some of the smaller development countries like the ASEAN members, and also small but rich countries like Singapore. So RCEP, if it's successful, can really provide a model for future trade liberalization across Asia Pacific.
And Troy, you just mentioned that there are two different kind of trade deals. Do you think RCEP will have any possibility to include the U.S. into any kind of agreement, or it maybe include some elements and aspects of TPP into this new framework?
I think U.S. involvement in RCEP in the short term is unlikely. In the long term, it's something that's definitely possible. The U.S. would most likely need to take and negotiate an FTA agreement with ASEAN first, given my understanding of the accession agreements within RCEP, and then that might be possible. But I do think as the negotiators look at RCEP, one of the things they should do is try to look at TPP, the U.S.-Korea, the Korea-EU FTA, and other modern FTAs, and see what types of innovations these agreements have that might help all the parties moving forward to make trade between each of them easier as well.
And another thing is that they talk about is both versions have a lot of geopolitical undertones, because obviously one agreement has China in this,
Yeah.
one has the U.S. Taking the lead. So how much of geopolitical momentum is playing the rules for trade deals?
Okay, actually, until recently, I think China became quite receptive to TPP. Of course, before the surprising result of the U.S. election. But I think if you want to make RCEP a genuine success, maybe we want to de-emphasize the political element to make that more as economic integration and less a political document, because otherwise it may just take very long time.
Henry, from your perspective, do you think there is any geopolitical undertone?
Well, I think it's okay to include geopolitical considerations. If you look at the RCEP and the TPP, you can see that China and the US actually have different visions with regard to the geopolitical concerns. The US, as Troy mentioned earlier, through their involvement in the TPP, is trying to change the domestic regulatory framework of many of the TPP members. So it's a bit more intrusive. But the RCEP is mainly aimed at dismantling the tariff barriers. So that is something which I think most countries, at least most development countries in Asia Pacific, would be more comfortable with, because they are not really comfortable with the idea of somebody, like the US come in and tell them how they should structure their regulatory framework, how they should institute certain rules and so on. So I'm not against geopolitical considerations in principle, but I think the different approaches taken by China and the US with regard to the RCEP and TPP shows that they have different visions, and it seems as of now that probably the Chinese version find more resonance in this region.
And Troy, as we all know, Donald Trump is a businessman. So do you think when he conducts trade talks, he has less geopolitical baggages as his predecessor?
I think so. One of the things that he is primarily concerned about is creating jobs in the United States and ensuring that we don't lose jobs to competitors overseas. So I think what he's going to focus on is how can he take and create a deal that will bring the most benefits to the United States. He's really focused on this. We've seen in the run-up to his inauguration, both in terms of trying to negotiate the deal with Carrier to stay within the United States, and how he's talked more and more about restructuring the incentives for companies to be involved in the United States. So I think you're going to see focuses in the U.S. on things like tax reform, efforts to make the U.S. a better environment, but on trade you'll see the same things. Deals that will try to make the U.S. more attractive for investment.
But he's not interested in having any kind of multilateral trade agreement with Asia Pacific countries.
At this point, it doesn't appear so. He seems to be very concerned about these agreements. That being said, I think one of the key things we need to remember about RCEP is that I think it actually is very important for RCEP to move forward. We're at a point where we're seeing, TPP is unwinding, the Doha round unwound. The EU almost was unable to take and move forward with its FTA with Canada because of one province in Belgium. I think we're at a point to where we need some positive news on the trade front because we've seen a lot of setbacks recently.
But obviously, Donald Trump wants a better deal with all his trading partners, but that won't be easy. China is a big trading power, ASEAN is a big trading power. What do you think the future of trade deal frameworks?
I think it's going to be challenging. I do agree with Troy. I think Donald Trump is going to do something very drastic on tax cut front. But as he said just a couple of days ago, there's a good trade, there's a bad trade, there's dumb trade. So I do think there will be more trade frictions. But of course, it's still too early to say. I mean, we don't know what he's going to do in the first 100 days. But I think more trade frictions really is.
But it's going to be constructive or destructive?
Well, depends, right? Depends whether initially China and the U.S. would play hardballs against each other. I hope, I just hope, as I said, we haven't heard many good news in the past. I hope we are going to get some good news.